Lilacs by Carolyn Meyer. Chapter 1. Garden of Eden. In the time before we knew that we would be driven away, our lives uprooted, and our people scattered, Grandfather Jim Williams spent every spare minute tending his beautiful garden in Freedom Town. He loved that garden, and I loved him. The garden was my favorite place. "It is the Garden of Eden, Rosalie," he would tell me, his crinkled brown face shining with quiet pride. "Right here in Freedom." I knew, of course, I was 12 then, and I thought I knew a great deal, that God had created the amazing assortment of trees and bushes and flowers abounding in that paradise, as colorful and bright as the counter spaces Grandmother Lila stitched for each member of our family. But I also knew whose careful hands set the tender young plants in the richer brown earth, dark as my skin, and nursed them as they sprang up and flourished. And I knew that many of my plants and bushes and vines had come from the much larger, much finer gardens belonging to Mrs. Eunice Bell, where my grandfather worked. He had what we called toting privileges. He was allowed to take along whatever he had trimmed or thinned or weeded out of Miss Bell's garden and plant it in the Garden of Eden. For instance, he had dug up a sucker from the white lilac of Mrs. Bell's kitchen door and coaxed it to take root in the front yard. He laid out a curving path leading to it with odds and ends of broken bricks that my brother Henry bought from him, the brickyard. And he built a low picket fence around it so children playing in the neighborhood would not accidentally come too close to his precious white lilac. It's very rare, he proudly told those who admired his sweet-smelling blooms. Purple lilacs are common, but only once in a long while do you come across something like this. "Fusses over it like a child," Grandmother Lila murmured. "Because its name is most like yours," he told her soothingly, and she smiled at that. I remember that the white lilac near Mrs. Bell's kitchen door was in full bloom on the day the ladies of the Garden Club of Dillon, Texas, came to her house for a luncheon. I had gone along to help Grandfather in Mrs. Bell's garden that day as often as I did, just to be with him, and I watched the ladies arrive under the porte cochere where her husband, Mr. Thomas Bell, parked his Packard automobile. They wore dainty white gloves and stylish hats to shade their faces from the harsh Texas sun. They strolled in their soft leather shoes on the winding brick walks my Uncle Tio had laid through the garden under Grandfather's direction. And they exclaimed at what they saw. Mrs. Eunice Bell liked to claim all the credit for the garden, although I'm sure the club members knew very well that it was Jim Williams who made it so special. 2 or 3 times a year, Mrs. Bell would stop outside of the grand house on Oak Street and lead Grandfather around the garden, giving him guidance, as she called it. "Jim, I think we have shades of pink over yonder on the west side," she said with a wave of her hand, "and blues and purples back there toward your shed." But next to the White House itself she would only have white flowers, hostess and creamy lilies and tall irises, set off by their deep green leaves. There were to be no yellow flowers or orange or orangey red anywhere. "I've never been fond of those colors, Jim," she would say. My grandfather knew to follow her respectfully, nodding as she spoke and murmuring, "Yes'm, yes'm," and she'd get her shades of pink and blues and purples and whatever she wanted them, and her green and white alongside the house. In Grandfather's Garden of Eden, the colors were all jumbled up together, and he had added some yellow and orange flowers on his own. I liked that better. It's the way I thought the first Garden of Eden probably was. After the ladies had time to admire the flowers and praise Mrs. Bell for creating such a beautiful display, she led them inside. Not through the kitchen, of course, where my Aunt Tilly was fixing her lunch, but up the broad steps of the veranda that wrapped clear around the side of the house. She ushered them past the pots of white geraniums and through the etched glass door that opened to the east parlor. I was glad to see the ladies pass inside, because that meant that I might have time when my work was done to make a few drawings in the lined tablet I kept hidden in the garden shed. I particularly like to draw flowers. Just that minute my Aunt Tilly leaned out the back door and anxiously beckoned to me. I need you to serve the lunch, she said as she stepped into the kitchen. Cora's taken sick. My cousin Cora, Aunt Tilly's daughter, must always serve the lunches to the company and the dinners to the Bell family. Mr. Thomas Bell and Mrs. Eunice Bell and their daughter Catherine Jane, who was 2 years older than me, and their son Edward, when he was home from college, and any guests who might come by. I had known the Bell family all my life. Mrs. Bell was kind, generous even. She often sent home Catherine Jane's old clothes for me, pretty dresses with lots of wear left in them that Mama had said I must be grateful for. But I did not feel easy around any of the Bells except for Catherine Jane. And now Cora had sent the word at the last minute with Uncle Tio that she was feeling poorly, and Aunt Tilly decided I would have to take her place. My mother's whole family worked for the Bells, and now I was included. Although it helped in the kitchen sometimes, peeling vegetables or scrubbing the pots when the Bells had a big dinner, I much preferred to be out in the garden with Grandfather Jim. Aunt Tilly had never before asked me to serve in the dining room. Nevertheless, she took hold of my arm and pulled me into the pantry to put on Cora's uniform. Cora was 19, big and robust like Aunt Tilly, and I was a kind of skinny little thing, and that black uniform hung on me like a bed sheet on a pole. Aunt Tilly attacked it with pins, bringing it down to size. She tied it with white organdy apron, starched crisp as paper around my waist with a bow in the back, and set the little pleated white coif on top of my springy black hair. She made me put on Cora's black shoes with rags stuffed in the shoes to keep them from slopping up and down. Then she pointed to the great big silver tray with the 10 china bowls filled with creamy soup, which I was to carry out to the ladies, whose voices could be heard like soft music on the other side of the swinging door. Now, Rose Lee, when you set something down in front of a person, you stand on her left side, Aunt Tilly explained. And when you pick up an empty bowl or a plate or whatever, you stand on her right side. Lower left, raise right. That's the rule, understand? Without waiting for a moment for me to answer, she gave me the silver tray a firm push through the door. Go, she said. The long table was set with white linen mats on the dark polished wood and linen napkins folded to show the embroidery in the corner. Silver spoons and forks lay alongside flowered china plates. To save my life, I could not figure out how I was going to follow Aunt Tilly's rule. I loaded down with that enormous tray. Then I heard Aunt Tilly push open the door a crack. Set the tray on the sideboard, Rosalie, she hissed at me. Sideboard? I looked around and saw a low cupboard that appeared big enough to accommodate the tray, and I lurched toward it, setting the tray and the bowls down with a clatter. There was a catch in the conversation, and I knew Mrs. Bell was drilling holes with her little blue eyes. My hands were shaking, but then the talk resumed, and I picked up 2 soup bowls by their graceful curved handles and set them down in front of the 2 ladies closest to me. One in a hat with so many feathers she looked like a little bird. The other wore no hat and a plain gray suit. Her straight brown hair was fastened back from her face with a pair of combs. Her voice was clear and sharp as ice water, not warm and syrupy like folks around here. I continued until all the bowls had been safely delivered. That's when I saw Catherine Jane was also at the luncheon. Catherine Jane must be getting awful grown up, I thought, sitting with her mama's friends. She had the most beautiful blonde hair that hung down way below her shoulders, rippling in waves, or when it had just rained or was about to, screwing up into tight curls, though never as tight as mine. Today, in honor of the party, she wore it pulled back with a big white bow. I was careful not to look at her in the face when I set the last bowl in front of her. I thought she was being careful not to look at me. Now I had 10 little china plates left on the tray. What was I supposed to do with them? I was terrified that Mrs. Bell would be upset at this, upset that I wasn't Cora, who surely knew better. I fled back to the kitchen empty-handed and plowed into Aunt Tilly, who had been watching my performance through the crack. Rose Lee, you're supposed to carry the soup bowls on the saucers and set them down together, just like you do a cup of coffee. But there's already a big plate there, on top of the big plate, Rose Lee. Big plate, little plate, soup bowl, that's how it goes, she said, demonstrating the order with her hands. Then she smiled. White folks use a lot of dishes, she said. You get used to it. I could feel tears coming. I longed to be in the garden with my grandfather where I felt at home, digging or drawing or one or the other, but not this. Aunt Tilly patted my shoulder. It's all right. They're still busy talking. Now, take in these corn muffins and pass them around. Let each lady help herself. From the left, Rosalie. I tiptoed into the dining room, carrying a silver basket lined with a fine linen cloth that had hot rolls stitched on it in pale, satiny letters. Mrs. Bell was too busy listening to her guests to pay me any more notice as I slipped around from guest to guest, holding out the basket of muffins. Even Catherine Jane wasn't looking at my way, like I was a complete stranger. But it's so obvious, Eunice, said the lady in a large white hat, reaching for a muffin. She had a ring with big diamonds on her finger. Something has to be done about Freedom Town, and this is the answer. My ears perked right up when I heard her mention Freedom Town, the neighborhood where I lived. Most all the Negroes of Dillon lived there, except a few colored folks who didn't have regular jobs, but got along as best they could and lived in a collection of rickety old shanties to the south of Dillon in a place known as Dogtown. Back then, and this was known in 1921, Freedom as we called it, it was our part of Dillon. There was everything you could want in a town. Our colored school and 2 churches, and a grocery store and a cafe of whatever else a town could be expected to have. Our own colored doctor, mortician, and everything. It just happened that Freedom was right in the middle of Dillon, white people on every side of us. But we got along fine, long as we colored folks stayed in our part of town except to work. At least, that's what I thought. I should think those poor Negroes would be happy to leave Freedom Town, said a lady in a lavender dress. Such a muddy old place with that Hickory Creek overflowing every time there's a heavy rain. We'll simply move them to a more appropriate area. But they're like children. They may have to be persuaded that it's for everyone's good. The silver basket trembled in my hands. Who was this lady to speak about moving people out of Freedom? Move who? Move where? Mrs. Bell began to pass around the buttered dish, and I rushed back to the kitchen. They're talking about us, I whispered anxiously to Aunt Tilly. You're not supposed to listen in on other folks talk, she said sternly. You're supposed to mind your work and make sure they get served right. I couldn't help hearing. Don't talk about it now, she warned me. It's bad business. Nevertheless, I stood by the door and strained to hear. It's important that we get to work on this as soon as possible, said Mrs. Eunice Bell. Tom's seeing to the legal papers so that we can talk to people around the town about the plan and circulate a petition. The site is perfect for a park, said another lady. Most every other town the size of Dillon in the state of Texas has a city park. Dallas has several beautiful parks for years now. If we're going to be a growing community and attract the right kind of people, we must have a park here. And gardens, Miss Bell added, and I can picture some lovely formal gardens designed for year-round blooming, like mine. I'd be happy to help with the planning. Don't forget a library, added someone else. And a women's club. Certainly the town needs that to raise the level of culture. I frankly cannot think of a single soul who could have the slightest objection to this plan, said Mrs. Bell. Except the Negroes, said the lady with the voice like ice water. Mostly I couldn't understand her, but I understood that. And then Mrs. Bell laughed, and the other ladies started to laugh too, appreciating what must be a joke. Did you hear me, Rosalie? Aunt Tilly whispered, yanking me away. Get to work. Their iced tea glasses must be about empty. I knew by the look on her face that Aunt Tilly had been listening too. I swallowed hard and pushed open the door. The pitcher, beaded with sweat, stood on the sideboard ready for me to carry around to each glass. I can imagine you'd have a different point of view from ours since you're new to Dillon, Miss Firth, said Mrs. Bell was saying in a voice thick and sweet as honey to the lady with ice in her talk. They probably do things much differently up there in Philadelphia, but this is Texas after all. Our Negroes aren't like yours. As Madeline says, they are childlike. And I'm sure they all be very, very happy to have a nice new homes. That's always a source of pleasure, no matter what your race, don't you think? She gazed around the table at her guests, who all murmured, "Oh, yes." "We're not without our Negro problems in the North," the lady explained. I thought she looked a lot younger than the other ladies. They're arriving by thousands from all over the South looking for factory jobs, and they live in the most deplorable conditions. Our Negroes wouldn't leave to go north," Mrs. Bell said in a confident tone. "I can say with complete assurance that they're perfectly content here." Then I saw her frown. "Is the ham ready?" she asked, not recognizing it was me, Rosalie, who was usually out in the garden with mud on my knees, instead of in here in the dining room with the sparkling chandelier and the thick carpets. "Yes'm," I said. Aunt Tilly was waiting for me, scowling. "The bowls. Did you gather up the soup bowls?" I had to rush back and collect them. Ray's right, I remembered at the last second. I'd hoped that I would not miss something important at their conversation, although I hated what I was hearing, and it frightened me. "What's wrong with you, Rosalie?" Aunt Tilly scolded when I came back. Dirty bowls and unused saucers clattering on the silver tray. But of course she knew. This was just her way of telling me that I had to wake up and do things the right way, no matter what was wrong with me. This time I had to carry a platter of neatly overlapping slices of ham and little bundles of asparagus, and a bowl of tiny new potatoes. Now, what was I to do? Uneasily I looked to Mrs. Bell for help, who said only, "Put them down here, please," pointing to the silver trivets in front of her. "I'll serve them." I knew I should leave then, but stubbornly I stayed, standing motionless to one side where I'd hoped she wouldn't notice. Catherine Jane noticed, though. I caught her looking at me, and I dropped my eyes, stared at the swirling pattern in the carpet. Somehow I managed to get through the rest of the meal. The lady from the north talked about her new job, teaching art at the Dillon Academy for young ladies, and she told them about the prize-winning roses her mother grew in her garden in Philadelphia. The subject changed to roses. There was no more about Freedom Town. I served the dessert pudding and carried in the silver coffee pot and matching sugar bowl and cream pitcher, glad that Mrs. Bell preferred to pour the coffee into the delicate china cups herself. The ladies carried their coffee onto the veranda, and Aunt Tilly told me she didn't need me to stay and dry the china and silver as she washed it. Afraid I'd break something, I guess. I was relieved to be out of the house and back in the garden. I found Grandfather behind his shed near the vegetable patch where he grew things Aunt Tilly could use in Mrs. Bell's kitchen. Garden lettuce, a few tomato vines, some spring onions. When he went into the shed, I followed him. In the stifling darkness, I repeated what I had heard in the dining room. He listened, nodding. "Can they make us move, Grandfather?" "I don't know," he said. "Can if they mind to, I guess." He was quiet for a while, cleaning his tools. Something about the way Grandfather answered made me nervous, and after all I had no heart for drawing. The tablet stayed in its hiding place.